All right, welcome back to part two of this lesson series. We're still looking at the programs from the government and community organisations focused on social inclusion. Okay, so as we've been going, just a reminder, we've been assessing each program to see did it actually increase social inclusion or did it not? Or what are the positives and negatives? Because we know this is a really juicy dot point, likely to be asked in a HSC exam, likely to be a 15 marker like it was a few years ago. So there's a lot here to unpack, and it's always good to have an assessment of things. Now we're going to look at, in this part of the lesson, the Northern Territory intervention and two community groups. Okay, so just a fair trigger warning before we go into it. The Northern Territory intervention is something that's still happening today, and it's a really, I found it quite heavy to look at and research when I first found out about it a few years ago. Well, a while ago, I looked at it at uni. But it really is quite horrific. So if you want to talk about any of it to anyone, please let me know, and I can help put some support measures in place. But the Northern Territory intervention. So in 2006, that should say 2007, my apologies. So the Northern Territory, so a bit of context. So the Northern Territory government commissioned a research into allegations of serious sexual abuse of children in Aboriginal communities after there were reports of pedophile rings in the Northern Territory. Now, the reports of the pedophile rings and the abuse of children in Aboriginal communities, the idea that it was perpetrated by Aboriginal people. Okay, that's key part number one. Number two was, after these allegations and reports, an inquiry was launched to find a better way to protect children. And so this report was finalised on the 15th of June 2007, and it was called The Little Children Are Sacred. And the report basically said that it should be designated as an urgent issue of a national significance by the Australian and Northern Territory governments. They said it was that bad, these pedophile rings, that it needed national intervention. So less than a fortnight after it was published, so this is really quick, so a week later basically, almost a week later, so that's really quick for the government to act on anything. The federal government staged a massive intervention in the Northern Territories, including sending army troops into the Northern Territory to intervene. So this was huge, okay? A really big intervention to try and stop these so-called pedophile rings. Now, before I go into some of the laws and stuff that was imposed, I'm going to quickly scooch down to some of the criticisms of it, okay? And it's this main point here. The pedophile rings actually proved to be totally false, and that there was no actual written reports, according to Ray Jackson, president of the Indigenous Social Justice Association, of any pedophile rings whatsoever in the Northern Territory, and there was no record or official record of sexual abuse perpetrated by an adult in the Northern Territory. In fact, if you look at the government's own statistics the year prior, which was the AB Australian Bureau of Statistics, it had the percentage for child abuse or neglect or anything under that umbrella for Aboriginal people in Northern Territory at 4.2% of the whole population, but for non-Indigenous it was 9.3%. So the idea that Aboriginal pedophile rings were the big problem, when literally the non-Indigenous children had more than double the likelihood to experience neglect or child abuse, not necessarily sexual, but in total, I guess shows the racial vilification and discrimination and prejudice towards Aboriginal people here, where you are more than 2 times more likely as a non-Indigenous the year before this report was conducted to actually do it. And then on top of that, the idea that the president of the Aboriginal Social Justice Association has yet to read any reports about it is quite... what's the word? Like, it's baffling. Okay, so I just wanted to get that out there. So what actually happened as part of this Northern Territory intervention was a lot of new laws were imposed, which are still in effect today until the end of 2022. So this is still happening today, guys. Okay? Still ongoing. It's been rebranded. It's got a new name. It's called the Northern Territory Emergency Response Plan now. But it's basic, and it was reviewed in 2012, 2013. But it was just rebranded to sound nicer. It's still happening. And here's some of the laws that were imposed. Okay? It removed a permit system for access to Aboriginal land. Okay, so government was able to access Aboriginal land, which overturned previous legislation where you needed a permit to make any changes or residency there. So basically they stole more land off them. Okay, this is Terra Nullius 2.0 in 2007. It abolished government-funded community development employment projects, which provided thousands of local Indigenous jobs. So it abolished that. It subjugated Aboriginal children to teaching in a language they don't speak for the first 4 hours at school. So the idea was that these were in very remote communities in the Northern Territory. Obviously their first language was their own Aboriginal dialect, but they were forced to learn English, again for the first few hours of the day, and that responsibility was taken away from parents. So that reminds you again of what the stolen generations, where people were forced to forsake their own culture at the expense of another. They suspended 50% of welfare payments if you were in the Northern Territory. Here's a big one. They suspended the Racial Discrimination Act. So the Racial Discrimination Act that we looked at last lesson, which made it unlawful to discriminate against people, has been suspended in the Northern Territory to this day. Okay, so they got rid of that, okay? Because if that was in play, obviously the government's own actions would be unlawful. But they suspended that. How they had the power to do that is probably above my pay grade, but it's factual that they suspended it. They subjugated Aboriginal children to mandatory health checks without consulting their parents, so taking away autonomy. They excluded Aboriginal customary law and traditional cultural practices from criminal sentencing decisions. So the idea here previously was that you would take into account Aboriginal people's own customary laws as part of the sentencing process. They stripped that away. So basically, if you want to draw a little arrow here, they limited community consultation, okay, which we know leads to further social exclusion. They banned all alcohol on Aboriginal land. In fact, if you were found to be found with alcohol, like even an empty tin can at the bottom of your car or something, you could go to jail for 6 months for a single can of beer, or 18 months or more if you had 1.35 litres of alcohol or more. So if you had a bottle of grog, you could go to jail for up to 18 months. If you were found to have a single can of beer, 6 months jail time. Insane. So that's pretty crazy. It also provided the Australian Crime Commission with what they call Star Chamber powers when it investigated Aboriginal communities. So this overrided the right to remain silent. Okay, that's a pretty big one. Okay, so everyone, that's kind of like a human right that's upheld in constitutions, that everyone has the right to remain silent. You see it in the movies all the time, the Miranda rights, XYZ. That was overridden. So it was now unlawful to remain silent if you were questioned by police. It gave police the right to enter houses and vehicles only in Aboriginal communities without a warrant if they suspected alcohol possession. Okay, so any breach of privacy or dignity is gone there. So no warrant is needed to search a house. You just had to suspect there was alcohol possession. It allowed them to make laws, get this, for information to be transferred about any individual to any government agency without their consent. So again, if you draw an arrow here, privacy was taken away. It banned all sexually explicit or very violent material, what they called, on Aboriginal land. So you can see this sign here, a big sign saying no pornography, and maximum penalties I think here's like $5,000 up to $22,000 or 2 years jail time for 5 or more items relating to pornography. Okay, crazy. So jail time if you look and watch a video on the internet. And it also expands the school enrollment and attendance measure. So under this measure, parents of students So say you're a parent and your kid truanted school, which they're now forced to go to, and for the first 4 hours of the day, they're speaking a language they don't even understand. If any kids truant there, the parents lose their welfare payments. They get cut off. So, and these are just some of the laws. So, in essence, they had control over almost every aspect of Aboriginal people's lives. There was no privacy, there was no autonomy, there's no dignity, stripped all away, all based off a false allegation, which still is yet to this day not to be proven in concrete. Absolutely insane. Now, that's some of the laws that they made. So here is some of what I've put in this heading is support. So this is all the government's, I guess, funding that they introduced into the Northern Territory intervention to help combat combat social exclusion, to promote social inclusion. This is all based off pedophile or allegations of pedophile rings. So what they did was invest $583 million in more teaching positions, in creating teacher housing in remote communities, professional development for workers in the education system, and a nutrition program providing school meals every day. Now, in actuality, and many of these schools I don't think have even been built, and I don't think they've invested all that money according to my research on this area. So the proposed support and what's happening in reality is very different. There was an investment, this is probably one of the good things, or probably one of the only good things that had come out of it. There's been an investment in constructing 16 women's safe houses. And so a women's safe house is if they're fleeing from domestic violence, they can take their kids and go to that house, no questions asked. And the idea is that they keep you safe, they feed your kids, they put them into like some education programs and that sort of thing as well. And they also had mobile child protection teams because the Northern Territory is so vast. They could come to you if you needed it. So that was one good thing. There was a $600 million boost to services such as community night patrols, remote policing, and other legal services. The employment of 60 full-time Northern Territory police officers and 4 new police complexes in the Northern Territory, and a substance abuse intelligence desk, which is intended to help bust drug distributions from other states into the Northern Territory to reduce substance abuse, and also the funding of night patrols. Now, how any of this, especially this one, is targeted towards preventing child pedophile rings remains to be seen. So you can sort of read between the lines with the funding and this intervention what they were really trying to do. The idea that land rights were taken away, what link or correlation does that have with pedophile rings? Again, I'm not sure. What does suspending welfare payments have to do with it? What does losing all your local jobs have to do with it? So all of these kind of measures put in place, as well as a lot of this funding, is really suspicious, and it doesn't necessarily link to the problem. I guess the only few that really do is this idea of safe houses for women. So I guess if there was a pedophile ring and it was domestic abuse or domestic sexual abuse, that would be good. And then the last one was $76 million to tackle alcohol abuse in alcohol management plans, etc. And the idea is that a lot of abuse happens when parents are drunk. So some of these funding makes a little bit of sense, and a lot of it doesn't. Okay? And I guess when you're looking at the actual issue at hand, or the alleged issue at hand, it just doesn't stack up. And then the last point here is that a lot of Aboriginal communities were offered these government services on the condition that they sign away their property rights by leasing that land that they own back to the government. Okay, so you're losing your land rights, you're losing your property. Keep in mind, they've suspended a lot of your welfare payments. You've lost your job, okay? You're going to go to jail for 6 months for having a can of beer. You're going to be fined $22,000 if you watch a porno on the internet. And then the idea is, we've got all these services for you, but now you have to give me a house. If you're in a desperate situation where you've lost your job, you don't have welfare payments, you've been in jail and penalised for things that everyone else. So any non-Indigenous person in the Northern Territory can drink as much as they want. They can go to any school they want. They can have grog, whatever. It's only for Aboriginal people. So you can see, I guess, maybe there's a hidden agenda under here. So that's some of the support. If we look at the criticisms of this, which I think is the main point that you'd probably talk about in any essay, are some of the following things. Now, we've already gone through this one, which was, again, the fact that a year before, there was an Australian government survey conducted which showed that you were twice as likely to experience abuse if you were from a non-Indigenous family versus an Indigenous family, right? So where's the intervention, I guess, for non-Indigenous is the argument there, if it's twice as likely to happen there. But then the second and most important one was that they proved to be totally false. There's been no official report arising, according to the president of the Indigenous Social Justice Association. So that's one criticism, okay, that this whole intervention is foundless, it's factless, it didn't happen, or there's no evidence of it happening. So we'll go back to the top here. The criticism. So many policies didn't actually protect children, or they weren't even related to achieving this goal, which is what I was just talking about earlier. All this funding going into police officers for night patrol, taking away land rights, and I've listed it all here. So the compulsory acquisition of land, the abolition of a permit system with land rights, so you don't need the permit to access Aboriginal land anymore, offering housing and other services in exchange for land rights as well. I might even add here welfare payment suspensions, the education requirements. So remember that they were... I'll get you to write that because I'm running out of room. Oh, actually, I'll write mandated education. Mandated education. So if you want to add that too. So all of these things have got nothing to do with achieving the actual goal, which was to stop the pedophilia ring, right? How does all of this relate? So that's one criticism. It doesn't actually protect children against the main measure of the goal. A big, sorry, I just brain farted there. Another criticism is that the policies really return to a reflection of the paternalistic approach to past policies of assimilation. It reminds you of the era of terra nullius, colonisation, taking away land rights. It reminds me of the stolen generations and really trying to rip families apart, like when they're talking about suspending welfare payments, forcing kids to speak languages they don't know, excessive penalties only if you're Aboriginal, like excessive jail time for something so minor. All of these sorts of things really do remind you of colonisation sort of days. And so that approach was in an era where Indigenous people weren't even recognised as citizens in the Constitution, where they weren't counted in the census, had no traditional land rights, had their wages stolen and their families torn apart. That's what this policy is going back to. And did we not, I mean, technically this happened before the National Apology, but the Bringing Them Home report has been out for 10 years prior to that. So people are well aware of what stolen generations were and the impacts that it had. And it's pretty much backflipping on that whole report and returning to that paternalistic approach of assimilation. So that's a big criticism there. You've said it's a really big issue that we need to close the gap. We need to do this, that and the other. but we're going to intervene in the Northern Territory and strip away, I guess, what we've been advocating for the past however many years and gone back to what we were doing 200 years ago. Another criticism is that there was no community consultation whatsoever. So similarly how we looked at why the Closing the Gap initiative failed, the intervention was just imposed on Indigenous communities, okay, without any respect or perspectives of the communities. No one said, hey, what's going on? There was no real talk with elders, or there was no ownership for Aboriginal people about any of the solutions. Again, it was very similar to previous policies like the Stolen Generation, like the first Closing the Gap initiative, where things were done for them, not with them. Okay, so no community consultation is another big criticism of the Northern Territory intervention. And lastly, I guess similar to the second point, but slightly different, is that it's actually the job of governments at all levels to address the needs of their people. And the idea that the government can deliver all of these services in less than, how long did it take? It was a week. In less than a week, or about a week, when none of these things, and these things were neglected for decades, is really quite profound, I think. But the main criticism here is that you can deliver all of these services in partnership with Aboriginal people, but without all these discriminatory laws attached to them. That's one of the big criticisms there as well. There's a little cartoon here, or political cartoon you can do a content analysis of around the intervention here. Is the idea of, we will consult with you, we'll notify you every time we make a decision. Okay, tongue-in-cheek there. I'll put a little note here, and I'm going to read it out to you. No other group in Australian society receives services on this basis. To make it legal to implement the intervention, the Racial Discrimination Act and Northern Territory anti-discrimination laws were suspended. They had to suspend them to be able to do this. Australian and international law, human rights, prohibits discrimination on the grounds of race. However, the governments claimed that it was necessary to override these human rights in order to protect children. And we also know, way up when we look at, right at the very start of this course, that in the Australian Constitution, Section 51 gives the government powers to make laws with respect to any race of people, whether for their detriment or benefit. Okay, so that power is still there. So, like I said, no other group in Australian society receives this. Any non-Indigenous person, even though they're twice as likely to have more child abuse, were not subject to any of these things in the Northern Territory intervention. So, this leads us to our table. Positives and negatives. So the positives. They had measures to reduce alcohol-related violence. Tick. They improved domestic violence programs and funding, i.e. the women's safe houses. They provided resources to refurbish housing, although the caveat was that you had to sign away your whole property rights to get it. They had school nutrition programs where they fed kids and put in meals each day. And there were more doctors, nurses, and police checks and health checks. Okay, so actually I'm going to get rid of that police, because that was a bad thing really while they were there. So more, so cross that out on yours. So more doctors, nurses, and health professionals committing to more health checks. Okay, we know that life expectancy, child mortality, and Aboriginal people suffer from more health-related illnesses. So that was a good thing. However, all of these positives come at the caveat of taking away your human rights. So that needs to be stated. The explicit negatives here is that it's discriminations on the bounds of race. Okay, they suspended the Racial Discrimination Act to be able to make this legal. There's absolutely no evidence of pedophile rings to support the initial purpose behind the intervention. Okay, numerous human rights breaches. You look at privacy, consent, security, culture, right to practice your culture, income, the right to employment, all of that taken away. There was no community consultation in the decision-making process. The assimilation policies were similar, or well, not identical, but very similar to the stolen generations. If you want to put here as well as terra nullius when they were taking away land rights. I think I'm going to add that. I'm going to shorten this a little bit, give me a bit of room. And terra nullius. Whoops. Okay, so that's another thing. Disrespect for Indigenous culture. So they excluded Aboriginal customary law from criminal sentencing, don't forget. So they took away that sort of cultural right there. There's excessive and disproportionate penalties for minor crimes, i.e. 6 months jail for a can of beer. And yes, I'm aware I spelled jail the American way. You can replace it with the Aussie way, G-A-O-L. And the idea that despite all of this intervention, incarceration of juveniles, as you know from the justice system stats we have looked at in previous lessons, absolutely skyrocketed due to these punitive laws, as well as the adult population, but the juveniles in particular just went absolutely berserk. Let's find that stat again. Here, so 24 times more likely than non-Indigenous to be sentenced to jail as an Aboriginal juvenile. This increases in the Northern Territory to 43 times more likely. Huge. In fact, a lot of things we looked at as like things in healthcare, it doubles in the Northern Territory. So all of these things that we had looked at, where it's worse in the Northern Territory, I guess you know why now, the Northern Territory intervention. So that's a really big one. Okay, so if we assess this overall, was it effective in promoting social inclusion? Absolutely not. It actually created more social exclusion. Now I'm going to quickly run through these two. These are community organisations. The syllabus dot points are also asking us to look at community organisations as well as governments in implementing programs for social inclusion. So I've looked at two here. One's, I guess, at a macro level, if you want to write that up here. This is kind of a macro example. They operate in a lot of areas in Australia. Whereas Bungri is a local one. This is a Central Coast agency. Okay, so you can write Meso here, up the top. So Generation 1, the Mingerloo Foundation, also known as Generation 1, is a philanthropic, I think I pronounced that right, philanthropic organisation. So philanthropic is basically when rich people make charities to help poor people, in a nutshell. And their mission was, again, to reduce the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, specifically to do with employment and income. So what they did was they partner with different communities to provide training. So like they provide construction training and things like that. There's a quick video here that you can watch that I'll put in the lesson where you can see the types of things they do. But basically a lot of the services they offer is guaranteed employment and training through their VTEC initiative, which stands for something I can't remember. But that enables Aboriginal people to get employment. Okay. They provide masterclass and education training sessions for Aboriginal entrepreneurs or I don't want to say wannabe entrepreneurs, but people wanting to pursue creating their own business. And part of this includes meeting with what they call an angel investor. So an angel investor is someone who will invest money in your company with no strings attached. And basically, if you make the money back, you pay them back. But if it fails and falls on their head, there's no strings attached and you don't owe them any money or anything. That's why they call it an angel investor. You know, they come from the heavens and save you. It has a parent employment service as well, which helps source jobs for unemployed Indigenous parents. And it also implemented which is kind of a bit of a Debbie Downer, what they call a cashless debit card. So this is one of the community organisations which, I guess I need to backtrack a bit. So when governments give out grants, so say here where the government gave, $76 million to tackle this or $500 million to tackle this, sometimes they offer them as contracts to private organisations to fill because the government doesn't have enough resources or employees or anything like to do them. So there's a lot of private community organisations, a lot of which do really good work, but they have to apply for that funding. So part of the thing with Generation 1 is they created the cashless debit card implementation scheme. So 80% of the welfare money that was transferred to Aboriginal people that they were eligible for went to this special card, and that card can only be used at approved stores. So that card won't work on grog shops, it won't work at casinos or gambling or anything like that. So the idea is it's designed to help reduce spending money on unnecessary things. So they get 20% of their payment in whatever bank account they choose, but 80% gets stored on this card and they can only use it in certain areas. Now you might think that's a good thing. You can see the idea behind it, but it actually is a negative here because it decreases Indigenous autonomy. It subliminally says we don't trust you with your own money that you're going to get. You're probably going to spend it all on alcohol and gambling anyway, so it's really got, I guess, racist connotations behind it, which is why it's a negative thing. But the positives of this is that it helps Aboriginal people get employment and education. Okay. So is it effective in promoting social inclusion? In some areas, and in some ways, yes. In others, no. And the last community organisation is Bungaree Aboriginal Association, which is actually located in my local neighbourhood, Tuggerah, on the Central Coast. But they've been working here for 20 years, and they provide services to children, families, elders, as well as people with disabilities that are Aboriginal. So some of the services they offer include the following. Aged care, so transport services for people, elderly Aboriginal people to make medical appointments and help with home maintenance and things like that. They have housing services as well, so they are part of the social housing grants that the government gives out. So if you're at risk or homeless for 2 or 3 months in between jobs or something, they can house you and keep you safe there. They also provide disability services and support workers to help with daily tasks for Aboriginal people with a disability. And they have what's called an education gaps program. So they give family services such as tutoring or help with finding jobs or help with tertiary pathways and education pathways for families that are part of their service. So that education's not just for kids with school, although it is, so they help prepare people for the workforce, but it's also helping with parent mentoring and education programs to help parents become better parents. Because if you look at, again, like the stolen generation impacts, a lot of these people don't even know who their parents are, they don't know how to raise a kid. All of that knowledge and narrative and oral history was never passed down because of the stolen generation. So they can help reconnect them with culture in that way as well. I think they also, though, can impose a cashless debit card scheme with welfare payments as well, which I haven't put in here. So the positives of Bungaree is that it's very, very similar to the Mingerloo Foundation, is it helps people with employment and it helps people with education. We can also say it helps them with housing services and aged care as well. There is a practice HSC question here, which you can do. I'm not going to enforce this one on you just yet. As part of trial preparations, I think would be a good question to definitely do, especially when you're preparing for your HSC, regardless. But I'm not going to physically enforce this one because I know you have a lot due currently. But yeah, just keep that in mind. If that's something you want to do, I'll definitely mark it. I'm fairly confident you should be able to break down this question comfortably because of the practice we've done with 15 markers a lot of the time. So that concludes part 2. Really, really big lesson this week. A lot to cover, as you can see, but it's a massive dot point. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.